Today, I'd like to explain a little about making worksheets for use in English class. I teach junior and senior high school English in Japan. A good worksheet is one that you can use several years in a row. The first thing is always proofread your worksheet. It should look good. It should look professional. You're being paid to be a teacher, so if you have the time, and most of the time you do, then make sure that your worksheet doesn't have any typos. You might think of putting Japanese on your worksheet, but if you're not a native Japanese speaker, then you might get the Japanese wrong. So if you really need to use Japanese on the worksheet, and usually you don't, get your Japanese coworkers to proofread it. You can use whatever software you want. I use LibreOffice because it's free and multi-platform, and you can have it in English even if your computer is Japanese. Microsoft Word is okay, or you could use Google Docs if you want. Whatever you use, think about whether you're going to have access to that piece of software in several years. If you use some obscure word processing software, it might be great now, but if you change schools, your new school might not have it, and that would be a pretty inconvenient thing. Next, try to use the default settings most of the time. You want to use the default margin, probably in Japan that's 2 centimeters on each side, and that's good because photocopying and hole punching is always going to work. If you try to use narrow margins, sometimes the photocopiers and the hole punches will take out things in the margin, and that's a big problem. Also, try to use the default fonts. If you're using LibreOffice, the default fonts are Liberation Sans and Liberation Serif, or if you're using Word, I recommend Times New Roman. If you use obscure fonts, they're going to look fancy, but when you open the document on a new machine that doesn't have those fonts installed, then everything is going to fail and you'll have to fix all of the layout. And you're not going to want to because you're trying to do it right the first time to save you time in the future. Here's a worksheet that I made for an English class where we're studying science. Let's look at the title first. You should always have a title. The title should be at the top. The title on the paper should also be the name of the file, and then you can find it faster later. Often you want a subtitle, which could be the name of the course, or the grade of the students, or possibly the year if it's something that changes a lot from year to year, and that's going to help you keep your files organized. You also need a place for students to write their name, their grade, and their class, and possibly their student number. In Japan, students often use a student number. Part 1 is true or false. In general, true or false questions are better than multiple choice questions because they are more similar to what you find in real life. It's rare that in real life someone gives you 4 different choices and you have to pick the correct one. And it's quite common that someone says something or someone asks something and you have to say yes or no, or you have to decide if you believe them or you don't. Down below, I use a piece of clip art to divide part 1 from part 2. It's color on the computer, but it's going to be black and white when I print it out, so I don't want to use any super light colors because they won't print clearly. This is part 2. Here, students are writing animals according to the given categories, and this is a good example of something that has a lot of value when you check the answers in class. So when I get to part 2, I can ask the students, okay, what mammals did you write? And then they'll have to tell me what mammals they wrote, and after they tell me the mammals, then I'll say yes, yes, okay, yes, yes, no, that's not a mammal, yes, yes, great. And that's going to give my students a lot of motivation to speak because they're going to want to be heard. And it's also going to give them a chance to listen to their classmates' answers. And probably some of their classmates came up with pretty obscure animals. And it'd be neat to see what they have to tell us. Part 3 is more vocabulary practice. Students look at each animal and they decide whether it's warm-blooded or not, and they circle it. Now, when you're checking the answers in class, you can make this an additional activity by telling students how many warm-blooded animals there are, and then ask them to see if they have that number, and if they don't, to figure out which ones are wrong. Of the 20 words listed, suppose that 11 of them are warm-blooded animals. And I tell the students, okay, you tried answering it, but there's 11 warm-blooded animals. How many circles do you have? And then students can count their answers and see if they have 9 or 10, 11 or 12, and then they can talk to their classmates and try to figure out where the mistakes are. And that's kind of gimmicky, but it's a nice variation on true or false, and it's a perfect way to practice vocabulary. Part 4 has short answer and long answer writing, and specifically questions 5, 6, and 7 involve the student writing what he or she thinks. Those questions are ones where if the students were copying on the entire worksheet, if they write down the same answers for question 5, 6, and 7, you know that they copied and you can catch them there. Typically, I make the last section of my worksheet consist mostly or entirely of questions where students are writing either about themselves or about their views, and that's good because they need to learn how to express themselves, but it's also good because if they're copying, then you can catch them and then give them a 0. Finally, I want to stress 2 things. First, make your worksheets look professional. The students don't care if you have a few mistakes on occasion, but if you have mistakes on a regular basis and things look sloppy, they'll start to think you're a sloppy teacher and you'll lose their respect. So make your stuff look slick. And the second thing is when you're designing your worksheet, you're using some kind of software, and sometimes you're going to use tables or tabs or lists or pictures, charts, graphs. And if you're trying really hard to make something look good, but it's taking a super long time, then stop, because probably there's a better way to do it that's faster, and maybe your coworker knows it. Or maybe there's not a way to do it faster, but either way, your working hours are limited. So try to make your worksheets fairly quickly, and then when you start getting bogged down, stop and change your plan. And that way you can get your work done on time and feel good about the high quality work that you deliver.